Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Ozark, Arkansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the winter of 1847, the Ozark Highlands sat quiet under a thin crust of frost, the kind that never quite softened at noon. Franklin County records describe the season as uncommonly still, with early snowfall and roads reduced to narrow ruts carved by wagons and mule trains. Ozark itself was less a town than a clustering of cabins, a courthouse of rough timber, and a scattering of farms pressed into hollows between low mountains. Travelers passed through rarely, and when they did, they were remembered. One such traveler appears in a ledger kept by County Clerk Edwin H. Rawlins, dated December 12 of that year. The entry is brief. Man calling himself J. Calder arrived from the east, took lodging north of town. No age is given, no origin confirmed, only that he paid in silver coin and asked curiously about families with sons who worked the winter trapping lines. This arrival coincided with a Christmas season already burdened by memory. Just over a decade earlier, forced migrations had passed near these hills, part of what newspapers of the time called the Indian removal campaigns. Even in 1847, elders spoke of abandoned camps and shallow graves along old routes, echoes of what history would later name the Trail of Tears. Ozark residents did not discuss it openly, but the land remembered. Calder rented a small outbuilding once owned by the Kincaid family, long since moved west. According to later testimony, the structure had served as a smokehouse, then a storage shed, and finally nothing at all. Neighbors described Calder as orderly, soft-spoken, and attentive in a way that made people uneasy only after the fact. He attended church once, sitting in the back, leaving before hymns ended. Christmas Eve brought heavy cloud cover and a wind that carried sound strangely. That night Martha Bell, whose farm bordered the old Kincaid plot, wrote in her journal that she heard wood striking wood, slow and deliberate, well past midnight. She assumed Calder was repairing something. Others recalled a single lantern burning long after the town went dark. On Christmas morning, Calder appeared at two neighboring homes, offering small wrapped parcels. Simple gifts, carved whistles, a knitted scarf, a child's wooden horse. He said little, only that it was proper to mark the season. The gifts were accepted politely. In a place as isolated as Ozark, kindness was rarely questioned. 3 days later, one of those gifts came back. It was left on the steps of the Rawlins home, wrapped in the same brown paper, now darkened and stiff. Inside was the scarf, heavy with dried blood. No explanation accompanied it. No tracks were visible in the frozen dirt. By nightfall, the sheriff had been notified, and Calder's outbuilding was found locked from the outside. What they discovered beyond that door would take years to surface fully, fragmented across affidavits, missing pages, and the kind of silence that settles over towns that realize too late they should have asked more questions. When Sheriff Thomas Elroy forced the lock on Calder's outbuilding, the first thing noted in his statement was not what he saw, but what he smelled. In an affidavit dated December 29, 1847, he wrote of iron, rot, and pitch. an odor inconsistent with a smokehouse long abandoned. The lantern light revealed a room cleared of most furnishings. Against the far wall sat a low table, its surface scarred with cuts that were too regular to be accidental. Beneath it, the packed earth had been disturbed and tamped down again, as if someone had worked carefully to erase evidence of digging. Calder himself was nowhere to be found. The sheriff ordered the soil examined, but winter frost limited what could be done without tools the town did not possess. For the moment, the door was barred, and a deputy posted nearby. Word spread quickly. By evening, Ozark's narrow lanes filled with murmurs and speculation. Some remembered Calder's questions about trappers and sons. Others recalled how his gaze lingered too long on hands, measuring them, as if assessing strength or age. Among the items recovered from the room was a small notebook, bound in leather, its first pages torn free. What remained were lists, names, dates, distances measured in miles between creeks and ridges. Several entries were crossed out. One name appeared twice: Eli Bell, Martha Bell's eldest boy, who had been away checking traps since before Christmas. Martha was summoned that night. Her later testimony records that when she saw the name, she said only, "He was meant to be back by the snow." The sheriff assured her it meant nothing certain. Yet by morning, Eli had not returned. A search party followed the creek line east, finding signs of a camp abandoned in haste. The fire pit was cold, the traps untouched. There were drag marks leading into the trees, then nothing. No blood, no body. Just absence. Local newspapers from Van Buren and Little Rock mentioned the case briefly, framing it as a likely animal attack. Privately, officials were less convinced. Dr. Henry P. Slocum, called from a neighboring county, examined the scarf returned to Rawlins' doorstep. His notes described the blood as human and shed without tearing of cloth, suggesting controlled injury rather than violence from a beast. As the days passed, more unease surfaced. Two other families came forward, each having received a small Christmas gift from Calder. One was a tin brooch, the other a carved spoon. Both items were found later placed deliberately at the edges of their property lines, stained faintly, as if washed and then dirtied again. In January, the ground thawed enough to permit digging at the outbuilding. What they uncovered was not a single grave, but several shallow depressions, each empty. Sheriff Elroy wrote, "Whatever was placed here was not intended to remain." Some townspeople whispered of old routes through the hills, paths once used by displaced tribes during the removals of the 1830s. Those forced marches, what history would come to know as the Trail of Tears, had left behind forgotten crossings and hidden clearings. Calder's notebook distances aligned disturbingly well with those routes. By midwinter, Calder was officially declared wanted for questioning. A description was circulated: medium height, dark hair, a scar near the jaw. No bounty was offered. Perhaps no one wished to draw attention to how little they truly understood. And then, as quietly as he had arrived, Calder became a name people stopped saying aloud. By February of 1848, the cold had retreated just enough to allow movement through the hills, and with it came rumors that refused to stay contained. A trader passing through Ozark claimed he'd seen a man matching Calder's description near the Mulberry River, traveling light, carrying only a satchel and what looked like wrapped parcels. The trader dismissed it as coincidence. Yet his account found its way into the sheriff's correspondence, folded carefully and marked unverified. Sheriff Elroy organized a second search, this time extending beyond the creek where Eli Bell vanished. The party followed an older trail, one not marked on county maps but known to hunters, and according to oral history, once used by families forced west years earlier. An elderly settler named Jonah Mercer testified later that the path predated us all, and that it carried a weight no road should. He refused to walk it after dusk. Along this trail they found signs of temporary camps, circles of ash, scraps of cloth, twine cut cleanly rather than torn. Dr. Slocum examined one such site and noted impressions in the soil consistent with repeated kneeling. No bodies were discovered, yet the absence itself became a pattern. As one deputy remarked in a letter home, "It is like searching a place already cleaned." Back in Ozark, attention turned to Calder's past. No records could confirm his name. Church registries yielded nothing. Land deeds listed no previous residents. A letter sent to counties east of the Mississippi returned unanswered. The man had arrived without history, and now his departure seemed just as complete. In March, Martha Bell received a letter postmarked from Jackson County, Missouri. Inside was a scrap of knitted wool, unmistakably Eli's, part of the scarf she had made him years earlier. There was no message. The sheriff attempted to trace the postmark but found no matching sender. The letter was added to the growing file, already thick with contradictions. At this point, folklore began to intrude where facts failed. Some claimed Calder collected blood for medicinal purposes, echoing old European beliefs. Others insisted he was merely a conduit, delivering offerings to something older in the hills. These theories were dismissed publicly, though private journals suggest even officials were not immune to unease. A mid-year review of the case referenced broader regional upheavals, displaced populations, transient laborers, and lingering scars from forced removals. One magistrate noted that communities along former removal routes experienced unusual crimes of disappearance, rarely solved, rarely discussed. Though he did not name it directly, the shadow of the Trail of Tears lingered in his assessment, shaping both geography and silence. By autumn of 1848, the investigation stalled. Funds were low. Witnesses recanted or moved away. The outbuilding north of town collapsed in a storm, scattering its remaining contents into the mud. Some said this was an accident. Others believed it convenient. Yet Calder's name surfaced one last time that year. A preacher traveling through eastern Arkansas wrote of a man who attended a Christmas service, left gifts behind after the sermon, and vanished before dawn. The description was close enough to trouble those who read it. Whether this was Calder or merely another shadow cast by a fearful season remains uncertain. What is certain is that Ozark entered the winter of 1848 quieter than before, as if the land itself were listening. The winter that followed settled hard over Ozark, and with it came a reluctance to record anything at all. County minutes from late 1848 grow sparse, as if clerks themselves felt that writing gave shape to things better left indistinct. Sheriff Elroy remained in office, but his correspondence slowed. In one letter to a colleague, he admitted, "We pursue a man who leaves no weight behind him." It was the closest he came to acknowledging defeat, yet fragments continued to surface. In January of 1849, a trapper named Silas Grady was found dead along a tributary of the Arkansas River, some 40 miles from Ozark. The coroner ruled exposure, but an addendum noted unusual marks along the forearms, small, deliberate incisions, partially healed. Grady had passed through Ozark the previous Christmas season. He had also received a gift, though at the time he joked that it was too fine for a man who lives in mud. The gift was never recovered. Dr. Slocum reviewed the coroner's notes months later and added a margin comment, pattern emerging. It was not an official conclusion, merely a question scribbled in ink already fading. Slocum would die the following year, his papers divided among heirs, some lost entirely. As the case aged, its details migrated from ledgers into memory. Stories changed with telling. Children dared one another to approach the ruins of the Kincaid outbuilding, though little remained beyond a darkened patch of ground where grass refused to grow. Farmers avoided that corner of the land, citing poor yields and restless livestock. One man claimed his horse would not cross the old trail no matter how gently he coaxed it. In 1852, a small fire swept through the county records office. Officially, it was blamed on a tipped oil lamp. Unofficially, some suspected intentional clearing. Several documents related to the Calder investigation were destroyed. What survived did so by chance. Letters kept at home, journals forgotten in trunks, a single affidavit misfiled under an unrelated case. A visiting professor from Tennessee, Caleb Whitrow, examined the remnants in 1856 while compiling a study on frontier crimes. He concluded that Ozark's case fit a broader pattern of vanishing individuals along historic migration corridors. He referenced earlier displacements, noting that land marked by forced movement often retained a tendency toward erasure. His work briefly mentioned the old removal routes associated with what history would later formalize as the Trail of Tears, though he treated it as context rather than cause. Whitrow never identified Calder. Instead, he wrote that the man functioned less as an individual than as a mechanism, appearing where records thin and trust is offered freely. It was a cold assessment stripped of folklore yet no less unsettling. By the late 1850s, Ozark had changed. New families arrived, roads improved. The Christmas season resumed its modest celebrations, but certain habits endured. Gifts from strangers were refused. Names of travelers were written carefully and remembered. And when something was left unclaimed on a doorstep, it was not opened until morning. Even then, some claimed that on winter nights, a single lantern could be seen moving slowly along the old trail north of town, pausing where no cabin stood anymore. No one followed it. No one recorded it officially, because by then, Ozark had learned that some returns carry a cost. The years pressed on, and with them came a gradual smoothing of the case's sharpest edges. By the early 1860s, Ozark was no longer a frontier settlement but a modest town shaped by commerce and passing traffic. Still, the Calder file remained, thin yet persistent, resurfacing whenever a disappearance occurred nearby. It was during this period that a former deputy, Aaron Whitcomb, offered a belated statement, prompted by what he described as a need to set down what was seen, not what was proven. Whitcomb recalled an unlogged visit to the outbuilding site in the spring of 1849 after the official search had ceased. He claimed to have returned alone, driven by unease rather than duty. In the soft ground exposed by rain, he noticed impressions inconsistent with ordinary foot traffic, patterns suggesting careful pacing, repeated over time as though someone had practiced movements there. At the center of these marks was a shallow pit, refilled, its soil darker than the surrounding earth. Whitcomb did not dig. Instead, he marked the spot mentally and left. Years later, he admitted regret. "We were taught to look for bodies," he wrote, "not for the places where bodies had already been taken away." Around the same time, scattered reports emerged from neighboring counties of parcels left behind after church services, small plain gifts bearing no note. In most cases, they were harmless. In one instance, a farmer near the White River claimed the cloth wrapping smelled faintly of iron, though nothing visible stained it. No connection was officially drawn to Ozark. Perhaps none was desired. The Civil War years complicated matters further. Records were disrupted, populations shifted, and disappearances became common for reasons entirely unrelated. When the conflict ended, many unresolved cases were quietly folded into the chaos of the era. Calder's name faded from conversation, surviving only in marginalia and memory. Yet in 1871, nearly 24 years after the first blood-stained gift appeared, a surveyor mapping land north of Ozark uncovered something unusual. Beneath a stand of young trees along the old trail, he found a cluster of personal effects buried together: buttons, a tin whistle, fragments of knitted wool. No bones accompanied them. The items were turned over to the county office, where an aging clerk recognized one immediately as matching descriptions from the Bell testimony. An inquiry was briefly reopened, but time had dulled its urgency. Witnesses were dead or gone. Sheriff Elroy had passed years earlier. The evidence, such as it was, suggested deliberate separation of objects from bodies, a practice with no clear explanation. A note appended to the surveyor's report referenced the broader landscape history, mentioning that the burial site aligned with an older clearing once used during forced migrations decades prior. Again, the shadow of the Trail of Tears hovered, not as a direct link, but as a reminder that the land had long been shaped by movement, loss, and concealment. After that, the case closed itself through inertia. The items were archived, then misplaced. The clearing grew over. Children were warned away from that stretch of woods without being told why. Even now, long after the last official mention, locals speak carefully of gifts received too freely and paths best avoided in winter. They say Ozark remembers what it is shown, and sometimes what is returned is meant not to be understood, only endured. By the late 1870s, the Calder matter existed less as a case and more as a residue. It surfaced in conversations the way dampness returns to stone, uninvited, persistent, and always tied to certain places. One such place was the old trail itself. Though newer roads had rendered it unnecessary, it remained visible in winter, a shallow scar where frost settled differently. Farmers swore snow lingered there longer than elsewhere. In 1878, Professor Elias Monroe, a physician with an interest in anomalous rural deaths, visited Franklin County while compiling material for a regional medical journal. His focus was not Calder directly, but patterns of blood loss without fatal trauma reported across several decades. In Ozark, he was shown what remained of the Bell file and the surveyor's report from 1871. Monroe noted that the incisions described in earlier cases were consistent in placement and depth, suggesting intent rather than frenzy. Monroe interviewed an elderly Martha Bell shortly before her death. She spoke calmly, telling him she no longer believed her son had been killed near Ozark at all. He was taken somewhere prepared, she said, according to Monroe's notes. The hill knew before we did. When asked what she meant, she declined to elaborate. That same year, a hunter named Reuben Clay disappeared after boasting in town that he would camp along the old trail to prove the stories foolish. His rifle was found days later, carefully cleaned and wrapped in cloth, leaning against a tree. No blood was present. No tracks led away. The search lasted a week before being abandoned due to early snowfall. Clay's disappearance reignited local unease, but officials resisted reopening old investigations. Instead, the event was recorded as an accident. Privately, Monroe added it to his growing file. He would later write that Ozark exhibited a continuity of method across time, absent a continuous perpetrator, a phrase that unsettled even his peers. By the 1880s, folklore began to fill the gaps left by lost documentation. Some claimed Calder had been several men, operating under one name. Others believed the gifts themselves were symbolic markers, a way of claiming individuals already chosen. A few insisted the blood was not always from the recipient, but from someone else entirely, a warning rather than a record. None of these theories could be proven, and none were formally endorsed. What persisted were small behaviors. Doors locked earlier in winter, gifts opened communally, strangers watched until they passed beyond town limits. Ozark adapted, not through resolution, but through caution. In 1892, a fire destroyed a farmhouse built near the old clearing. The family escaped, but the ruins revealed scorched earth beneath, darker than the surrounding soil. When asked if anything had been buried there previously, the owner replied, "Not by us." The Calder file, such as it was, ended its official life there. Yet Monroe's unpublished notes survived, later cited by students as an example of how cases can outlive their perpetrators. He concluded one entry with a simple observation: places shaped by forced movement and loss tend to absorb human acts differently. Again, he alluded to the long aftermath of removals like the Trail of Tears, suggesting that violence did not always end when history said it did. As the century closed, Ozark stood outwardly settled, yet inwardly attentive. Some winters, a gift still appeared on a doorstep, harmless and clean. Other winters, nothing did. And it was often the nothing that unsettled people most. As the 19th century waned, the Calder matter slipped almost entirely into the margins, preserved less by ink than by habit. Newcomers to Ozark noticed rules no one openly explained. Parcels left unattended were reported, not opened. Winter travelers were offered food but not lodging near the northern ridge. Children were taught the geography of the hills as much by avoidance as by use. In 1896, a schoolteacher named Lydia Harlan began collecting local histories as part of a state education initiative. Her notes, later donated to a private archive, include several interviews referencing the Christmas business, though none would name Calder directly. One elderly man told her, "It weren't the man, it was the returning." When pressed, he clarified only that things meant to go don't always leave whole. Harlan was struck by how often the old trail surfaced in these accounts. She walked it herself one afternoon, noting how the land dipped and rose with unnatural regularity, as if shaped by repeated passage long before surveyors arrived. At one bend, she recorded a sudden sense of pressure in the ears, though the air was still. She did not stay long. That same winter, a railway laborer passing through Ozark reported a sight that unsettled even seasoned listeners. He claimed that near dusk, he saw a figure kneeling beside the trail, arranging small objects on the ground. When approached, the figure gathered them calmly and stepped into the trees without haste. The laborer admitted he never saw the man's face, only his hands, bare despite the cold, stained dark at the fingertips. The report was dismissed as fatigue. No investigation followed. By 1901, Professor Monroe's notes resurfaced briefly when a medical journal revisited unexplained blood loss cases. Ozark was mentioned only obliquely, its details softened by time. Yet Monroe's earlier observation remained intact, that some regions exhibit continuity without continuity of actor. Scholars debated this phrasing, but none could disprove it. In the final official mention of the case, dated 1904, a county clerk added a marginal note to an unrelated file. Old trail avoided, reason known. No further explanation was given. As decades passed, the physical traces thinned. Trees claimed the clearing. Roads cut through hills that once guided movement silently. Yet residents insisted that certain winters still felt wrong, marked by an expectant quiet that arrived just before Christmas. They spoke of it carefully, as if the land itself were listening. Because in Ozark, Arkansas, some gifts were never meant to stay given, and some returns once witnessed could never be forgotten. By the early years of the new century, Ozark's older residents had begun to pass away, taking with them the unrecorded portions of the story. What remained was thinner, filtered through second-hand recollection and cautious phrasing. Yet even as memory faded, behavior did not. The northern ridge remained unsettled ground. No homestead lasted there long. Crops failed unpredictably. Wells dug too deep filled with dark water that locals refused to drink. In 1907, a Methodist minister newly assigned to the area, Reverend Paul Denning, attempted to address what he called residual superstition. In his sermons, he urged parishioners to abandon old fears and trust in order and progress. Privately, however, Denning kept a journal that told a different story. After visiting several elderly congregants, he noted recurring references to a Christmas long past and to gifts that returned altered. One entry reads, "They do not speak of murder. They speak of preparation." Denning requested access to the remaining county files. What he found frustrated him. Missing pages, dates without context, affidavits referring to exhibits no longer present. Still, certain names repeated: Bell, Slocum, Elr, and always the unnamed man who arrived, gave, and vanished. Denning was struck by how rarely the word crime appeared in early records. Instead, clerks favored terms like incident and occurrence, as though unsure what category the events belonged to. That winter, Denning received a parcel at the rectory. It was small, wrapped plainly, left without a note. Inside was a wooden whistle, cracked but recognizable as old handiwork. There was no blood, no odor, nothing overtly alarming. Yet Denning recorded that he felt an inappropriate familiarity, as though the object had been waiting for him specifically. He burned it in the stove the same night. No other gifts appeared that season. In 1910, a group of university students passed through Ozark while surveying folklore tied to frontier violence. They stayed only 2 nights. In their published notes, they remarked that locals grew evasive when asked about disappearances, redirecting conversations toward weather and crops. One student wrote, "The silence here is not empty, it is maintained." Their visit coincided with renewed academic interest in how forced migrations reshaped rural crime patterns. Though the students did not explicitly reference it, their supervisor later drew comparisons to regions affected by the removals of the 1830s, including those tied to what history had formalized as the Trail of Tears. The implication was subtle. Land altered by mass suffering does not simply reset. By 1915, the Calder matter had reached the edge of its 50-year horizon. No new disappearances were officially linked. No suspects named. Yet Ozark continued to behave as though the case were unfinished. Older residents insisted that the hills still corrected mistakes, that anything taken improperly would find its way back, changed. They said it without drama, without accusation, simply as fact. And when Christmas approached, the town still listened carefully for footsteps that did not belong to anyone they knew. In 1916, a winter colder than most settled over Ozark. Ice glazed the hills in a way old-timers said they had not seen since childhood. It was during this season that Judge Nathaniel Crow, recently retired and known for his interest in unresolved cases, requested access to the remaining Calder materials. His intent, according to a letter to a colleague, was not resolution but containment of uncertainty. Crow approached the case methodically. He compared affidavits against church attendance logs, property transfers against burial permits. What troubled him was not contradiction but alignment. Independent witnesses, separated by decades, described similar behaviors: careful preparation, deliberate timing, and the recurring act of return. The gifts were not random. They followed completion. Crow fixated on one overlooked detail: the absence of violence at the point of disappearance. No struggle sites, no panic in recovered belongings. This suggested cooperation, or at least expectation. In his notes he wrote, "If force was used, it occurred only after consent had already been granted." Late that December, Crow walked the old trail alone, carrying a lantern similar to those described in early testimonies. He did not record what compelled him to do so, only that the act felt necessary. Near the bend where Lydia Harlan once turned back, Crow found something half frozen into the ground, a small bundle of cloth neatly folded. Inside was a child's wooden horse. Crow recognized it immediately. It matched a description from the 1847 Christmas gift ledger, one Calder had given to the Rawlins household, later reported missing. There was no blood, no damage, just age and careful preservation. Crow returned the item to the courthouse and locked it in a drawer. He did not log it officially. 2 nights later, the wooden horse reappeared on his doorstep. This time, the legs were stained dark. Crow did not summon the sheriff. Instead, he wrote a final memorandum, sealed it, and instructed that it not be opened until after his death. He passed quietly the following spring. The memorandum has never been found. From that winter onward, no one claimed to see lanterns on the trail. No gifts were left. No objects returned. The silence felt intentional, as though a process had concluded. Yet locals noticed something else. Each Christmas thereafter, the snow melted first along that old path north of town, revealing dark earth beneath, warm to the touch even at dawn. They said the hill had finished what it began, and that whatever had once come back blood-stained had finally been accepted. In the years immediately following Judge Crow's death, Ozark entered a period the local paper described as uneventful. On the surface, this was true. No disappearances were logged. No parcels appeared. The old trail faded further beneath brush and saplings. Yet several residents later testified that the uneventfulness itself felt imposed, as though the town were being allowed a pause rather than granted peace. In 1917, a federal land assessor named Walter Hemsley arrived to reevaluate parcels along the northern ridge for potential sale. His notes, recovered decades later from a personal trunk, reveal frustration with that section of land. Measurements refused to align. Markers shifted overnight. One entry reads, "Ground inconsistent," as if worked recently, though no signs of labor. Hemsley assumed erosion or animal activity. He did not yet know the local reluctance to speak of the place. During his third week, Hemsley took ill after spending a full day surveying near the old clearing. He reported dizziness and a metallic taste that lingered for hours. A local woman brought in to tend him later said he kept asking whether the giving had already been done. She thought it delirium. Hemsley recovered enough to continue work but requested reassignment shortly thereafter. Before leaving, he mailed a small package back east to his wife. It contained a bundle of pressed winter grass, tied carefully with twine. The accompanying note read only, "For keeping." His wife would later write that she never recalled receiving it, though postal records confirmed delivery. That same winter, Reverend Denning recorded his final unsettling observation. On Christmas Eve, he awoke to the sound of something being placed gently against the church door. By the time he opened it, nothing remained. Yet the snow beneath bore the imprint of a single kneeling figure, positioned as if in reverence rather than haste. The marks ended abruptly, not with footsteps away, but with smooth, undisturbed snow. Denning did not preach the next morning. By spring, Ozark's attention shifted elsewhere. The world beyond the hills demanded notice, and the town complied. The Calder matter slipped fully beyond the reach of living witnesses. What survived were practices without explanations, warnings without stories, and a geography still treated with care. Old residents would later say that the hill north of town no longer wanted anything, that whatever accounting had begun in 1847 had finally balanced itself, not through justice, but through completion. Still, they avoided the trail, because even when a debt is paid, the place where payment occurred does not forget the hands that once knelt there. After 1917, Ozark entered what later historians would describe as a period of administrative quiet. Records existed, taxes were collected, births and deaths logged, but the narrative texture of the town thinned. It was as if language itself had learned restraint. What was not written became as significant as what was. In 1919, a traveling archivist named Margaret Ives passed through Franklin County, cataloging courthouse materials at risk of deterioration. Her personal letters, never intended for publication, offer one of the last contemporary glimpses into the Calder residue. She wrote to her sister that Ozark felt edited, like a document with whole paragraphs carefully removed. Ives requested access to Judge Crow's sealed memorandum, only to discover that no such document could be located. The clerk insisted it had existed. Another claimed it had been transferred. A third suggested it had been withdrawn by the judge himself before his death. No receipt, no ledger entry, no burn record confirmed any of these explanations. While searching adjacent files, Ives noticed repeated references to returned property, always without description. Items logged as received, then crossed out days later with the notation claimed. No claimant named, no signatures. The dates clustered around late December, recurring across several years. One afternoon, while walking beyond town limits, Ives encountered the old trail by accident. Snowmelt had revealed it faintly, like a watermark beneath the soil. She later described feeling an urge, not fear but obligation, to follow it a short distance. At the bend, she found nothing tangible, yet she wrote that she had the distinct impression of having arrived late. That night, Ives dreamed of objects arranged carefully on a table she could not see fully, only hands, methodical and calm, sorting without haste. She woke convinced the dream was not symbolic but observational, as though she had witnessed an action already completed. She left Ozark 2 days earlier than planned. In her final letter from the town, Ives noted something she found impossible to classify. This is not a story of violence. It is a story of process. Whatever occurred here followed rules that were understood by someone, if not by us. After her departure, no further outside examinations of the Calder-related materials were requested. Interest waned. Time did what investigation could not, sealed the matter through attrition. Yet Ozark itself did not resume normalcy entirely. Each December, the town still grew quiet sooner than neighboring places. Doors closed earlier. Candles burned longer. And though no gifts appeared anymore, people continued to check their thresholds before stepping outside. As if acknowledging that even when nothing is returned, the act of looking remains necessary. By the early 1920s, Ozark's relationship with its own past had settled into something like an agreement. The town would move forward and the land would remain undisturbed. No markers were placed along the old trail. No official prohibitions were written, yet no one built there either. Survey maps showed the space as usable. Practice said otherwise. In 1922, a timber company attempted to purchase several adjoining parcels north of town. Their representatives met polite resistance, prices raised without explanation, contracts delayed, signatures withheld. One agent later complained that negotiations felt less like business and more like a test of patience. The deal collapsed quietly. The company never returned. That same year, a local boy named Harold Winslow went missing for 3 hours on Christmas afternoon. He was found just before dusk, standing calmly at the edge of the old trail, holding a bundle of twine and bits of cloth he could not explain. There were no injuries, no fear in his voice, only confusion. When asked why he had gone there, he said, "I thought something was waiting to be finished." The family did not pursue the matter, neither did the sheriff. Old residents took the incident seriously in a way outsiders did not. They spoke privately, comparing it to earlier accounts, moments when individuals felt summoned rather than taken. A woman whose grandmother had known Martha Bell remarked that the pattern was changing. "Before," she said, "they didn't come back." By the mid-1920s, interest in frontier folklore surged nationally. Ozark received letters requesting interviews, stories, confirmation. Most went unanswered. A few were returned unopened. The town had learned that attention carried its own risks. One letter, however, was kept. It came from a historian studying the long aftermath of forced migrations, examining how landscapes remembered displacement. He mentioned earlier removals in the region, what history had long since formalized as the Trail of Tears, and suggested that places like Ozark bore quiet continuities rather than isolated tragedies. The letter was discussed at length, then filed away. No reply was ever sent. As years passed, Christmas in Ozark became marked less by celebration than by observation. People noted what did not happen: no parcels, no stains, no returned objects. This absence brought relief but also a subtle unease, like a machine left running quietly in another room. Some claimed that on certain nights the wind along the ridge carried the faint sound of wood touching wood, slow, deliberate, never hurried. Others dismissed it as memory misbehaving. But memory in Ozark had always been careful about when it chose to surface. The later recollections, those offered without dates, tended to circle backward rather than forward. When pressed, older residents spoke as if time near the ridge folded in on itself, making sequence unreliable. Events were remembered by season and sensation rather than year. A hard frost, a quiet Christmas, a sound that did not belong to weather. One such recollection came from Ellen Price, recorded late in her life by a distant cousin. She described being a child when her father warned her never to accept a gift she did not see purchased or made. Not because it was dangerous, he told her, but because it might already be spoken for. Ellen said she never understood what that meant, only that the rule was never broken. Others recalled how the town learned to recognize completion. When something returned altered, stained, broken, or stripped of its former use, it was taken as a sign that whatever obligation existed had run its course. The worst fear was not loss, but delay. Items left too long unclaimed unsettled people far more than disappearances ever had. In one undated journal fragment, a hand identified only as R.W. wrote of discovering a small pile of objects arranged neatly on a flat stone near the trail: a button, a length of twine, a sliver of wood smoothed by years of handling. No blood marked them. No signs suggested recent placement. Yet R.W. wrote, they were not abandoned, they were concluded. Such language appears repeatedly in the fragments that survived. concluded, finished, settled, rarely killed, almost never murdered. It is as if the vocabulary itself refused to acknowledge violence, choosing instead the terms of transaction and closure. Even the land participated in this restraint. Farmers noted that tools left near the ridge rusted faster, as though used without them. Soil disturbed there compacted unnaturally quickly, erasing evidence of digging within days. Nothing remained open for long. One final testimony, taken long after the original witnesses were gone, came from a man who claimed to have seen the outbuilding before it collapsed. He said the interior was clean, not scrubbed, but orderly. Like a place you leave knowing you won't return, he said. When asked if he believed Calder had escaped justice, the man shook his head. Justice weren't the point, he replied. Order was. And so the story endured not as a warning, but as a boundary. Ozark learned where not to interfere. The trail learned to remain visible only when necessary. And Christmas, once the moment of rupture, became instead a time of careful balance. Nothing more was taken, nothing more was returned. But the arrangement, whatever its origin, held. The last entries that can be dated with confidence fall in the early 1890s, when the county undertook a quiet effort to reconcile old land claims north of Ozark. These were not prompted by curiosity, but by necessity. Deeds written in the 1840s still overlapped, their boundaries vague, their owners long dead or vanished. What had once been a practical inconvenience now carried an older unease. A junior clerk named Samuel Rook was assigned to compare the original claims against physical landmarks. His notes survive because he copied them into a personal notebook rather than the county ledger. Rook wrote that several descriptions relied on markers that no longer existed. The bent oak, the cleared rise, the old trail. The last phrase appeared repeatedly, even in documents that otherwise showed no relation to one another. Rook walked the land himself in the autumn of 1892. He found no oak, no clear rise, but the trail remained. He described it as shallow, almost polite in its presence, as if it did not wish to intrude. At one point he noticed that the earth bore faint impressions, aligned carefully, spaced evenly. Not footprints exactly, more like places where weight had rested briefly and been removed. That evening, Rook added a single line to his notes. This ground has been used recently, though not for travel. He did not submit that line officially. Around the same time, Judge Elias Morton, reviewing probate disputes, remarked that certain estates tied to the ridge showed an unusual pattern. Personal items were often missing, yet no heirs contested their absence. When asked why, one claimant replied simply, "They were already accounted for." Morton underlined the phrase twice in his margin. No explanation followed. In 1894, a winter sermon delivered by a visiting minister urged congregants to remember that giving, once done, carried responsibility. Several listeners later remarked that the words felt misplaced, though no offense was taken. Afterward, the minister declined an offered gift from a parishioner, insisting that it remain with its maker. He left Ozark the next morning. By the close of the decade, the Calder matter no longer existed as a file. What remained were habits, shaped and refined. Objects found where they should not be were not disturbed until daylight. The trail was not crossed in winter, and Christmas, while still observed, was treated less as a celebration than as a point of assessment. People watched not for signs of danger, but for signs of imbalance. Because in Ozark, Arkansas, long before the century turned, the town had learned something precise and difficult to articulate, that whatever had begun in 1847 did not require repetition to remain active. It required only memory and restraint. The recollections that followed did not attach themselves to calendars. Instead, they arranged themselves around absence. People spoke of years after the land settled or before the last fire, as if chronology had become less useful than condition. What mattered was whether things were in balance. One such recollection came from a midwife, Clara Henson, who worked the outlying farms for decades. She claimed that on certain winters, births near the northern ridge were strangely quiet affairs. Children arrived without crying, alert and watchful, as if listening before announcing themselves. Henson never wrote this down formally, but she told it to others with the same careful tone used for weather warnings. She also claimed that objects went missing during these births, small things. A thimble, a ribbon, a spoon. The families noticed but did not search. "It's better," one mother told her, "to let what's taken be taken." Another fragment, preserved only because it was misfiled among agricultural reports, describes a farmer who attempted to fence a section of land that brushed too close to the trail. Each morning he found the posts loosened, laid carefully on the ground beside their holes. Not broken, not damaged, simply removed. After the third morning he stopped trying. In that same fragment the farmer is quoted as saying, "I don't think it objects to us. I think it objects to being closed." This distinction appears often in the later material. Whatever force or process people believed operated there was not described as hostile. It was described as corrective. Interference was met not with violence but with reversal. The old men sitting outside the general store would sometimes speak of Calder, though never by name. They referred to him as the first to finish a thing the wrong way. When asked what that meant, they laughed softly and changed the subject. Laughter in these moments functioned less as humor and more as a signal that a boundary had been reached. As the years wore on, the trail itself narrowed further, visible only after snow or heavy rain. Some claimed this meant the work there was nearly done. Others believed the opposite, that the less visible it became, the more precise its purpose. No one tried to confirm either view. What endured was the understanding that not all histories are meant to expand. Some are meant to compress, to fold inward until only their effects remain. Ozark did not preserve the story to remember it. It preserved it to prevent its return. By the time the first automobiles reached Ozark's outskirts, the town had already decided what would and would not be carried forward. Progress arrived cautiously, negotiated rather than embraced. Roads were improved, but never extended straight through the northern ridge. Surveyors learned to curve their lines without being told why. In 1908, during one such road proposal, an engineer named Franklin Moore requested permission to dynamite a shallow cut near the old trail to ease the grade. The request stalled for weeks. When a reply finally came, it cited no technical objections, only that the land was unsuitable for alteration. Moore later wrote to his employer that the refusal felt unanimous in a way he could not explain. "No one argued," he said. "They simply agreed." Moore ignored the warning once, conducting a small test blast without notice. The charge failed to detonate properly, scattering stone but leaving the hillside intact. When workers returned the next morning, the scattered rocks had been gathered and stacked neatly beside the cut, as if tidied. No one admitted doing it. The project was abandoned that afternoon. Around this time, an aging Martha Bell, long past grief and close to death, was asked by a visiting relative whether she still believed her son might return. She answered without hesitation, "He already did, just not how we expect coming back to look." The remark was not elaborated on, and the relative did not press her. In the winter of 1911, a traveling photographer attempted to capture images of the ridge after hearing vague stories in town. Every plate he exposed near the trail came back blurred, though those taken elsewhere developed clearly. He blamed equipment failure. Still, he left without selling the photographs. By then, the Calder matter existed only as a set of decisions no one remembered making. The outbuilding site remained empty. The clearing remained unclaimed. The trail remained passable only when conditions demanded it be seen. On Christmas Eve of that year, a child asked her father why they left a candle burning overnight when no one was expected. He told her it was so nothing would need to knock. She accepted this answer without further question. And so Ozark continued, not haunted, not cursed, but adjusted. The town lived with a quiet understanding that some acts once set in motion do not end with discovery or punishment. They end when balance is restored and not a moment sooner. Even then, the place where balance was achieved retains its memory. Because memory, like the land itself, does not require witnesses to remain active. The final testimonies do not announce themselves as conclusions. They read instead like confirmations, small acknowledgments that nothing further would be added. By the late 1910s, Ozark had crossed fully into a different rhythm, one shaped as much by what no longer occurred as by what did. In 1918, during a particularly hard winter, a temporary shelter was erected on the edge of town for travelers delayed by snow. It was placed deliberately south of the ridge, despite being less convenient. When asked why, the organizer replied, "People sleep easier where things don't expect you." The phrase was repeated often afterward, stripped of its origin. That same winter, a final artifact surfaced. A boy digging for stones near a creek uncovered a small metal clasp, heavily rusted but intact. Older residents recognized it immediately as belonging to a brooch once described in early Calder testimony, one of the Christmas gifts that had been returned stained, then lost to fire years later. The clasp bore no discoloration now. Whatever had marked it was gone. The object was not displayed or archived. It was wrapped carefully and placed back where it had been found. The boy was told not to dig there again. He did not ask why. Shortly after, the old trail disappeared almost entirely. Snow no longer revealed it. Rain did not darken its outline. Only those who had known it before could point to where it had been. Newcomers walked over it unknowingly, feeling nothing at all. A retired schoolteacher remarked that this was how stories ended when they had done their work, not with answers but with obsolescence. "The land doesn't need to remind us anymore," she said. "We already know how to behave." No further gifts appeared. No objects returned. Christmas passed quietly, marked only by routine and restraint. The balance, if that is what it was, seemed stable. Yet some insisted that on certain nights, rare, unannounced, the ground near the ridge still held warmth longer than it should. That if you stood there long enough, you felt not fear but the faint pressure of attention already satisfied. Because the work that began in 1847 had not demanded resolution, only completion. The last record tied to the matter was never meant to be one. It appears as a marginal note in a weather log kept by Earl Maddox, a farmer whose habit was to write down frost times and snowfall depths for his own reference. On December 26, 1919, beneath a column marked temperature steady, he added a sentence that did not belong there. No return this year. Ground remains quiet. There is no indication why Maddox wrote it or what prompted the observation. Yet for those who later read the log, it carried the weight of a closing remark, an acknowledgement rather than a report. By then, nearly 70 winters had passed since the Christmas gift first came back blood-stained. Every person directly involved was gone. The sheriff, the doctor, the judge, the families who had received the parcels, all reduced to names in fragile ink or not remembered at all. What endured was not evidence but alignment. The town knew where not to build, where not to dig, where not to linger when snow fell early. Ozark no longer told the story outright. It did not need to. The lesson had folded itself into daily life, into how gifts were given and how strangers were regarded. The old trail, once shaped by forced passage and later by quiet reckonings, had slipped almost entirely from view. Its earlier role, first as a route of suffering remembered from the era of the Trail of Tears, then as a corridor of something colder and more deliberate, was no longer spoken of, but it had not been erased, only absorbed. Occasionally, someone would still ask why the northern ridge felt different. The answers varied: poor soil, bad water, an old habit. None were wrong, none were complete. And on certain Christmas mornings, when the frost lay thin and the town stirred slowly, a few residents would pause before stepping outside. They would look down at their thresholds, not expecting anything to be there, only confirming that nothing had returned. Because in Ozark, Arkansas, the unease was never about what was taken. It was about what had come back once, and what the land decided it would never need to return again.